All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have our first panel of the day. We've made it through security and design, and now we're going to talk about procurement. Procurement outside the U.S. is always an issue. There's tax incentives, things to deal with the vendors and manufacturers if it's bought in the U.S. and shipped outside of the country, or whether it should be bought locally. So for this panel, it's the challenges of procuring equipment in Latin America. Planning is paramount, and our moderator will be Jack McCarthy with Integrated Design Group, and we have representatives from Turner Construction, GE Critical Power, and Emerson Network. Thank
you. Good morning. Okay, who we've got up here on the panel, let's say we're going left to right. We've got Rick Wilson, Manager, International Trade Compliance, Emerson Network Power. Justin Minchey from GE Critical Power, in charge of Commercial Operations Leader, pardon me. And Jim Brownrigg, Vice President with Turner Construction Company. I'm going to let these gentlemen give you a little bit more description about their roles and responsibilities, and we'll start with Rick.
Good morning. My name is Rick Wilson. Work with the Liebert Products Group of Emerson Network Power in Columbus, Ohio. My current responsibilities are primarily for international trade compliance for our Liebert products. Previously, I've also been involved with on the logistics side, making sure internationally, domestic for our logistics operations worldwide.
Good morning. I'm Justin Minchey, Commercial Operations for GE Critical Power. Similar to the Emerson Liebert products, we have a variety of products for critical power applications, primarily in data centers. My teams handle inquiry, what we call inquiry to order, so any proposals, submittals, et cetera, that my team handles that along with application engineering support for the products we sell.
Good morning. My name is Jim Brownrigg. I'm a Vice President with Turner Construction. I have responsibility for data centers or mission critical, healthcare, industrial segments located in Houston, Texas, and from an international standpoint, worked over the past 15 years with Turner doing data centers in 13 different countries. So,
great. Thanks, guys. So what we're going to do here is go through a series of questions that we came up with that would help explain and get into detail with respect to some of the challenges that they're facing. And we've got a couple of different perspectives up here from the supplier side to the purchaser side. And when it's appropriate, I may chime in from the designer side. The first couple of questions are general in nature, and one we've discussed a little bit earlier today. This has to do with language and doing business in countries that where English isn't their native language. So, I guess I'll start with Rick. Rick, dealing with other countries, have you had any issues with the language barriers?
Generally not. We generally have representation, whether our own offices or distributor offices within those countries. In addition, for the products that we manufacture, the user's manuals that we create are generally available in many different languages. So bottom line is no, we really have not experienced too many problems with the languages.
Justin?
Similar to Rick, we're the same way. We typically have, especially in countries like Mexico, where we have local teams who are very versed in the local language, can interact with the local contractors, whoever it may be. So we typically would have local representation, either as a direct GE employee or a partner there that would facilitate any language barriers that may be.
I would say it's variable. I think that in Mexico, for instance, English is fine, but in Brazil, Portuguese is a challenge if you're not bilingual. And then it becomes regional as you move country to country through South America. So again, I think in Central America, English is reasonable, but it becomes more of a challenge in South America.
We've had a couple of issues just from my own personal experience in Mexico where I think Dax mentioned a little bit about slang terminology not being completely understood. When you get into technical terminology, whether you're talking about substations, transformers, or the components of a distribution system, sometimes those terms don't translate directly, and you've got to determine what the alternative means of describing the equipment or the system might be. And Google Translate, I know from personal experience, doesn't work perfectly every time. One of the other interesting items is one of the certification panels or boards that you hear about now often in Central and South America. ICREA, the abbreviation ICREA is International Computer Room Experts Association, which are all English words, but there is not an English version of ICREA published. So we spent quite a bit of time over the past number of months translating page by page the applicable sections that are required to allow us to design our facilities in compliance with ICREA requirements. Second question in general topics is standard international units versus imperial units. The U.S. obviously uses horsepower, uses BTUs and things of that nature, and the international community uses the metric system. Have you seen or expressed challenges in being able to translate from one to the other in doing business in these countries? And I'll start with Jim.
We have not. Our design documents we're working in English and in the native language, so that's not been, I would say, as big a challenge. I do think the technical terms, though, I remember when they say when you graduate from engineering school, you've learned the equivalent of another language. So not every, while you might have a bilingual individual or somebody that can go from one language to another, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the technical terms down, to refer to your point earlier.
Justin?
Yeah, typically our documentation is provided in both, standard and international metric units. So most of the documentation is there and clear, available, but you do need to watch out for it and make sure you're making the appropriate translation, and just be aware of it, and if it's not there, ask.
Great. And Rick?
Pretty much the same for our products. We get the documentation in both sets of units. In addition, when we look at our control panels, display panels, you can program them to be different units. If you want Fahrenheit versus Celsius, you can program that into the unit display.
Great. Okay, we're going to get into a couple of questions specifically dealing with procuring and terms and conditions. When a manufacturer is involved in an international project, such as one in the Latin American countries, what are some of the important issues that must be addressed, in particular as it relates to standard terms and conditions? And we'll start with Rick.
I think, first of all, you need to make sure that both parties have a clear and mutual understanding of those terms and conditions. From my take, looking at this from logistics and trade compliance, it comes down to the delivery terms. Here in the United States, we generally deal with the FOB origin, FOB destination, and most people understand that. It's defined through the Uniform Commercial Code that's in place with all of the states. You get outside the U.S. borders, and that does not hold true. So you want to make sure, again, when we talk about languages, when you're looking at delivery terms, make sure that the language that you're using is understandable. And there is a set of international delivery terms, INCO terms, International Commercial Terms. It's published by the International Chamber of Commerce. They generally update them about once every 10 years. And the most recent edition, INCO Terms 2010, has 11 different sets of delivery terms, starting from Ex Works, which is the minimal obligations on the seller, all the way up to deliver duty paid, where the seller is basically taking responsibility for everything to get the material delivered to the destination site, duty paid.
Justin?
Similar to Rick, the number one thing I would say is make sure that the terms are known and agreed by both parties, all parties involved. There are obviously costs involved with, delivery duty paid, and the costs are similar regardless who bears those costs. And as a manufacturer, if we're going to be responsible for those, we definitely have to price it into the job. So we need to know about it up front. It needs to be agreed. The worst case scenario is no one plans for those costs, and then at the end of the transaction, oh, we thought you were responsible. No, you were, and that becomes a lose-lose proposition. So if the terms are known and agreed, at proposal time, at request for quote time, and then there may be some negotiations that need to take place to understand, okay, we quoted X works, meaning you're going to send someone to pick it up at our dock, take total responsibility for it, as opposed to delivery duty paid. One other thing I would point out, if it is DDP or delivery duty paid, make sure the destination is clearly defined. In a data center, if you're building a data center, it's fairly difficult to stage equipment from, the States to a data center floor in Mexico City or wherever you may be building the data center. So typically there's a staging area or a warehouse locally, and the manufacturers, even if we're delivery duty paid, we're going to want to deliver to that warehouse past title, past risk of loss at that point, and then the contractor would, typically that's our preference is someone else would take ownership at that point and be responsible for moving it from the warehouse over to the final destination. So even delivery duty paid, the final destination is very important to understand. As long as everyone understands and it's clear in your contract, there's no issue. But those are some nuances to look out for, because you can, if it's a lot of equipment, it could be tens of thousands of dollars simply to get it across from the warehouse across the city to the final site. And then, okay, what if it falls off the forklift during transit? Whose insurance is going to cover it, right? So those are things that we have to watch out for. Make sure the freight, the goods are insured regardless whether they're in transit or they're sitting in a warehouse or they're on their way to the final destination. Make sure that the risk of loss is known and then properly covered.
And Jim, a contractor's perspective, a procurer's perspective?
Sure. I think the key word that both Justin and Rick mentioned was known, right? You might agree on, we might issue a scope of work that says we would like to purchase a DDP, but it's not always is that RFP received by individuals like Rick and Justin and understand what DDP means. I think it's very important to make sure when from a purchasing perspective that you assure yourself that the individuals receiving that RFP and responding understand what DDP means, because while it may be more well known in some countries that are used to a lot of import-export, it is not well known in the United States. So having it known and having the manufacturer or the vendor come back to you with exactly what they think DDP means is the only way I've been able to validate that we're actually getting a price that is inclusive of DDP terms versus DDU, in other words, deliver duty unpaid, but similar to FOB, et cetera, et cetera. So, and likewise, Justin, where you want to deliver it to a warehouse and hands off it, we want to deliver it to the site, right, and when you were responsibility there. So you got to find a meeting of the minds of where is that balance between risk transfer and cost met, right? So how do you get the most efficient cost, but at the same time make sure the risk is mitigated?
Okay, and I guess an example, or are there any anecdotal stories about unfortunate circumstances that occur if these terms aren't understood initially? We'll start with Rick.
Well, just generally, if both parties don't understand what their terms are, if they don't have a mutual understanding, one party thinks another party is going to take care of something, it doesn't get taken care of, so you're going to have a delay. So I think as a seller, you're responsible for transportation. You as a customer think I'm responsible for transportation. Nobody makes the arrangements. Goods are finally ready to go. There are no transportation arrangements. You're initially going to have some delays in getting that freight moved. You're also going to have cost overruns. Somebody didn't budget for those costs. If both parties think that we're not responsible, those costs have not been budgeted. So somebody's going to run into some cost overruns. And ultimately, you're going to have some unhappy customers. And from a seller's perspective, I mean, you want to build a long-standing relationship with the customer. You want to be able to do business in the future. And particularly if this is your first time on a contract, you don't want to start off on a bad foot with contractual disputes and sour the relationship on the front end.
So is there a takeaway of what one might want to proactively do to prevent these things from happening? And what's the suggestion? And
Well, I think what was already mentioned is make sure that both parties really do understand, instead of just putting in that term, whatever the term may be, DDU, DUP, FOB, whatever the term is, make sure that really the parties really understand what they're buying into.
How common are those misunderstandings?
Right.
Real common?
Well, for us, we'll say we generally deal with repetitive customers. I mean, we do a lot of intercompany sales. We sell through distributors. We've built up long-term relationships. So we really don't see that often. So I think where you're really going to see that is where you have a one-off situation. You have a new customer, a new seller relationship, and you don't have that long-term relationship where you've built this up over a period of years.
I think if you're buying it in country, you know, and in other words, Emerson is selling through a distributor or somebody locally, then it's not an issue because it's being bought by that distributor and then delivered to you in country. So that's not an issue. However, when you start buying things in different countries and transferring over borders is when you run into the issue, because the individuals you might have a long-term relationship with that you're purchasing from in the country you're resident in, not where you're shipping to, may not have that understanding. So I think it's dependent upon the location in which you're making the purchase and dependent upon where it's being shipped from.
I think it's also important to make sure that both the seller and the buyer understand the terms. And, you know, we use Incoterms on a regular basis, but there are things about Incoterms that may or may not be well understood. For instance, you know, title, passage, risk of loss, and who's paying for the freight are kind of two separate things. So it's kind of, a lot of customers will, well, you pay for the freight, therefore you have that risk of loss. No, we pass title when we shipped it per the terms of the contract. So those are the kind of things, the discussions you don't want to get into after the fact. You know, those they need to be very clearly understood. And the other thing for a manufacturer, whether it's GE or Emerson or someone else, revenue recognition is a very key item for us. And you know, we mentioned, you know, delivering to a warehouse. One of the primary reasons we want to pass title is, you know, for revenue recognition. If it's sitting in a warehouse for 2 or 3 months, if we still own that risk of loss, you know, per the, you know, accounting practices we have, we can't recognize that revenue. So we end up in effectively it costs us money to store it there. And so those are items that are very key to us as a manufacturer that we understand up front, and no one wants to be surprised after the fact and then end up it's not healthy for either us as a supplier or you as a customer to be in a situation where costs are being incurred that were not planned for and properly built into the job, regardless on our side or the buyer.
Great. Excellent information. I want to shift gears just a little bit and ask a couple of questions that are more contractor-based, and I'll go to Jim with these. If you could go into some of the challenges that you've had in selecting qualified subcontractors and finding good builders, contractors locally in other countries. Has it been painstaking? Has it been consistent? Or
I would say it's the painstaking, yes. Variable, yes. In other words, it's very regional, right? So it depends not only what country you're in, but what city within that country you're in. I wouldn't say that while you do have some traveling subcontractors, I wouldn't say it's as common as the U.S. data center market. So it's understanding, as we talk about Latin America, identifying those key subcontractors. If you're not currently working in that market, then identifying local partners that are educated and have experience with those qualified subcontractors. Understand, as you talk about some specific countries like Mexico, you're not going to get more than a 10 or 15% bond. They're not, you know, it's impossible. They don't have bonding capability. You're in some specific trades, you'll find that it's the availability of labor is not necessarily linked to the subcontractor. It's really linked to the individual foreman and the labor that they command in the market. Just because you wrote a contract doesn't mean they're going to show up and they're going to show up with all the resources to finish the job. That's not a given. We've had some projects where we've had, you know, more than 1 or 2 subcontractors have to come in to finish the project because the individual sub that may have bid the job and we painstakingly scoped them didn't actually have the labor to finish the schedule. And so you end up with cost overruns, you end up with you know, different workforces, and then, you know, this isn't a simple, you know, I'm gonna call your bond or I'm gonna stop paying you. They'll just simply stop coming to the job. So you've got to have a relationship. There's very common in Mexico is a prepayment called an anticipo, which is required to say it's, you know, you can write them a contract, but not till you give them the anticipo does it become real and they actually show up to the project. So you just need to understand culturally what the traditions are and the expectations so that you can effectively pre-qualify subcontractors and then really contract with them and get them to the finish line.
And you mentioned partnering at one point. What's been your experience with looking at local partners and understanding the culture a bit through that partner?
I would say we've had positive and negative. So we've had, you know, some partners in foreign countries that have been very successful, and we've had some that have been not so successful. If you asked me what the variable was, you know, I think there's some key issues you might take away from similarities in culture or similarities in contracting methods or similarities in how you might manage work. But boy, if I had the silver bullet, I'd love it.
Okay. Last topic here has to do with the delivery of design documents or construction documents. We've got our own experience in doing work with Turner on a project in Mexico, and one of the things that we learned along the way was the level of detail required on our particular set of drawings and the level of backup information that the local authorities required was extensive. One of the local people on site had mentioned to me that the level of detail on these drawings was required because the skill of the local labor force needed that level of direction in order to install the systems properly. But I know that there's some inconsistencies with that. So, Jim, if you could give a little experience on that as well.
I would agree. I think there's an approach that we're looking at. How do we get as much detail as possible onto the drawings and into the BIM model so that we can have a lower common denominator maybe from a skill set at the labor level. It's not that there's not capable labor. It's that, you know, we don't have as many of these types of projects or mission critical types of projects in those specific markets. So you're really needing to make sure you get all of the detail communicated and communicated effectively in a market that isn't really common to have BIM or isn't really common to have all mission critical type equipment. I found it interesting that there wasn't the U.S. market for major equipment is much more experienced with data center equipment. We talk about generators and UPS, et cetera, than when you go to some of these countries. So the expectation that they know what a 2 meg generator or 2.5 meg generator is going to be and the requirements for it is not necessarily known.
Great. Thank you. We're going to shift back to talk a little bit about free trade agreements. So the term free trade agreements is often used discussing products manufactured in one country for international distribution. NAFTA comes to mind. Any insight you could give to misconceptions surrounding free trade agreements? And we'll start again with Rick.
I think, number one, a lot of people view free trade agreements in the same light as a common market. They think, say, with NAFTA, that shipping product from the United States to Mexico is now as easy as shipping product from Texas to Oklahoma, and that's not true. All of the customs regulations are still in place, and if you want to take advantage of NAFTA, that's fine, but you're now layering on a whole new set of rules and regulations that you need to comply with. The second aspect of that, say from the U.S. perspective, is the belief that just because we build something in the United States, we have manufacturing here, we have assembly in the United States, that automatically qualifies the product for NAFTA treatment. And that's not the case. Again, there are rules and regulations that need to apply. And the rules that apply to NAFTA are not the same rules that apply to any other free trade agreement. You know, the U.S. has many free trade agreements. Mexico has a lot of free trade agreements. And each free trade agreement stands on its own. It has its own set of rules and regulations. If we ship a product from the United States to Mexico that qualifies for NAFTA, it does not necessarily qualify for free trade agreements with Chile, with Singapore, with South Korea. Each one has to be viewed in its own light.
Justin?
Yes, I agree. You know, primarily, I would encourage you, you know, there's many free trade agreements, and each one of them have their nuances, and it's probably impossible for anyone to know all of those unless you have you specialize in that. So would encourage you to, you know, hire an expert who understands if you're going to be importing equipment into a country, hire someone who understands those agreements, those regulations, and then make sure that they ensure that you get the proper documentation. You know, NAFTA, for instance, just because it's, again, made in the U.S. doesn't mean it's NAFTA certified, and there's a specific certification and certificate you should get with the equipment if you're going to be importing under NAFTA. There are other trade agreements between, you know, Mexico and the European Union, for instance. some of the things to watch out for there. If you're manufacturing in Europe, you're going to be imported into Mexico. You can't import the product to the U.S. first and then to Mexico, otherwise you violated the agreement, and you're going to end up paying import duties on that equipment. So those are just some examples of things that you need to watch out for. At the end of the day, just make sure that if you don't know, you hire someone who does know, and that's probably the best advice I could give you. Even as a manufacturer, we hire outside advisory groups to help us because even being a global manufacturer doesn't mean we know all of the answers. And so we hire someone who specializes either in that country or that region and can help make sure we are in compliance and that we are communicating with the customer appropriately, and then more importantly, providing the right documentation and accounting for all the costs that may be incurred with that.
I would echo the same statements. I'll take it a step further, is that not only is it associated with free trade and having country-specific or project-specific advice, it's also, the business registration, the contracting registration, the tax implications. So the advice, I think the best thing we probably did in our most recent projects in Mexico was hire an import-export attorney, because Mexico of most of the countries is probably the most difficult country I have dealt with from an import-export standpoint. The regulations are substantial, and to assure yourselves that you're meeting them, you really need an expert that's an expert in that country, and understands not just exporting from the U.S., but from anywhere in the world, because manufacturing is a global marketplace now. It's not a few countries things are being manufactured in.
Great. I want to move on to a topic that is relatively prevalent here in the U.S., and I'm curious about its prevalency in other countries. The talk of prefabricated design, off-site fabricated skids, full-fledged data centers, and things of that nature. So a lot of the time here it's to help expedite speed to market and get the products assembled, tested off-site first, and then finally constructed on-site. I'm thinking there, again, more along the lines of the skill sets and the expertise of the contractors. How often are you seeing prefabricated skids, assemblies, or structures being manufactured off-site in those types of countries? We'll start with you, Jim.
We absolutely are seeing pre-manufactured, whether it be skids or built-up air handlers or another type of equipment being manufactured, but those are still primarily manufactured in the U.S. or in Europe. So you're not having, it brings a whole nother host of issues associated with import-export, because now you have 3 or 4 major components that are coming onto a skid or coming into an assembly that then is going to be shipped to another country. So the layers of import-export regulations and duties become that much more complicated. So I would say it's becoming more prevalent. We're seeing absolutely in the U.S. and Canada skid manufacturing. I'm not aware of anybody in Mexico doing that at this point in time, but absolutely would, as the market grows, I think become an opportunity for someone to get into that business.
Okay. Justin, from a manufacturer's perspective?
Again, we've done it in the States. I'm not aware of doing it south of the border. Would anticipate there will be issues making sure there's a lot of components in those containers or skids, and having the documentation to correspond would be something we definitely would have to watch out for.
Challenging.
Yeah.
And Rick, any closing thoughts on that?
We are moving in that direction. We do have some products that we are doing some skid work, outdoor condenser units, looking at quick installation for co-load applications primarily, and that's something fairly recent. I'm not aware that we've actually exported any of those into South America yet. We also do prefabricated mini data center rooms, smart mod units that we call them, and basically it's a prefabricated building filled out with server racks, power equipment, and cooling equipment. But again, I'm not aware of those being exported to South America yet either. Okay,
great. A couple of other more general topics. Maybe these aren't so general. Any foreign exchange regulations that may impact the ability to get paid or to be paid timely? I know that there was I think, Jim, you may have mentioned something about getting contracts started to begin with, but I guess we'll start, we haven't started with Justin yet, so we'll start with Justin this time.
Obviously, most of the transactions that we deal in as a manufacturer in U.S. dollars, regardless where, any of the Latin American countries, we primarily use U.S. dollars. However, the customer may be paying in a different currency. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And it's really country specific, depending on, there are some countries that we consider high risk and we ask for cash in advance. Or some other type of security. So definitely, Venezuela for one has been very difficult, in recent times. It changes, right, between the political environment, what may be going on in the country at any given particular time. So just understand where you're doing business and protect yourself accordingly, whether it be, if you're requiring cash in advance, that's obviously a way to minimize that risk, but it's not always practical. And so, yes, currency exchanges, the risk that could be inherent with that local country's currency could be something you need to watch out for. Obviously, there are other much more stable economies that it's not really a problem. But in Mexico, we deal in U.S. dollars pretty every day. So.
And Rick?
I think just to add to that is you need to look at, in addition to traditional credit risk that you look at from a U.S. perspective, the political risk, the currency risk associated with those countries. And in South America especially, those risks are ever changing and you need to be aware of what's going on. Venezuela is a tough country. From time to time, Brazil can be very difficult. Argentina can be very difficult. And there may be certain mechanisms that these countries impose that become an obstacle to get paid. They may have import licensing regimes in which the importer has to go to the government to get an import license that allows them to get the foreign currency to pay. And that becomes somewhat of a delay to get it approved. And even once it's approved, that for the government to actually release the funds
Right.
when they become due. Going back, this is probably going back at least 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, the company I was with at the time, we were doing a lot of business in Argentina, and Argentina came up for, I'm not sure, maybe a year's worth of time, that they required time delay payments on all of the imports. And we were structured for all of our sales, came up to the 180-day terms. So you're selling to Argentina, and now you're saying, well, we don't get paid for 6 months. The good news with that is that those were all structured through letters of credit. They were payable under usance drafts, and once the bank accepted the documents and the drafts, you had the option then to discount that draft to get immediate payment. But again, you're discounting it, and you're getting a hit to get paid immediately.
Jim, any final thoughts?
I would echo the same statements. I think that it's common to do business in U.S. dollars, but in country, you're still going to do business in their local currencies.
Okay. And last of the scheduled questions, any advice to give the audience that they should be wary of when it comes to destination country import costs? And are there some countries that are better than others, if you will, among the group we're talking about? We can start. We'll start with Jim.
I think it's first, not all countries are the same. So you have to look at each country and say, what are your interpretations or your advisor's interpretation of the import-export codes? It is very complicated, at least from my perspective, to look at an import-export code and identify what this piece of equipment is when I read these descriptions of equipment. Which code does it fit? So is my duty 5% or 15%? That's a substantial difference if you're taking the DDP risk. So I think you need to get the advice. I think that if we talk about Latin America, while Mexico is complicated, you can get through it, and it can be a substantial duty, but you got to make sure you understand which import duty code is applying to that piece of equipment. Because while I might know equipment, when I read their code, I can't always understand why they're saying a UPS fits this code, but yet a generator fits this code, yet a piece of electrical switchgear fits another code. So I think you need to get the advice and understand whether the duty is 5 or 15%. Specific in Latin America, Brazil is infamous for extremely high duties for anything manufactured outside of Brazil. So you'll find a lot of manufacturing in Brazil. So you can buy country in product in Brazil, and that's probably the most difficult from a cost impact standpoint country to do business in South America.
Justin?
Yep. Rick mentioned codes. There are harmonized tariff codes for pretty much any type of equipment you'll buy that are mostly internationally accepted. However, as Rick mentioned, it's very, very important that you have someone who understands the local regulations and the local interpretations of those codes. And so it's very, can't say it, enough that you need someone who, if not local to that country, at least local to that region and does understand the laws of that country so that you don't, get in trouble after the fact.
And we'll close with Rick.
I think we need to remember that almost every country in the world except for the United States imposes a value-added tax. No matter what they call that tax, in most Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, it goes by IVA. Brazil, they call it IPI, but it's still a value-added tax. And when you import product into a country, in addition to paying whatever the duties are, you basically have to prepay the VAT going into that country. And the VAT is quite expensive. It's not unusual to see VAT rates as much as 20%. So you need to make sure that who's going to be responsible for paying that VAT up front and make sure that that's accounted for. And in addition, the good news is, generally speaking, when you're importing equipment that you have to prepay the VAT, it can become a credit. So you might be able to get your money refunded, but there are ways to do. You have to go through. You have to be VAT registered. So if you're, as a U.S. company, if we end up paying a VAT charge in South America and we're not VAT registered in that country, we're out whatever that may be, 10, 15, 20%. If we are VAT registered, then we might be able to file claim that as an input tax credit and get that refunded. But do we have tax debits to credit that against? If not, then we're going to be looking at actually a cash refund from the government, which is going to take months and months and months to get. So when we look back at we talked about Incoterms, understand who's going to be responsible for the import customs clearance and the duties and the VAT, and how are they going to get that VAT recovered.
Wonderful.
I might add just one thing.
Sure thing.
I think that Rick's comment there is very, very important to understand that so we have duty, and there could be multiple duties associated with a specific product based on the harmonized code. At the same time, VAT, which is what we'd like in here to sales tax, is usually country-based, not specific state-based as it might be here or a local municipality. That VAT, one lesson we've learned is that a customer might be building in X country. Building in that country, they have the ability to offset that VAT or that sales tax, if you will, based on their investment in the country or their taxes associated with doing business there. So in order for them to get, we might be paying a 15 or 20% VAT as you bring the product in the country. For the client might pay us the VAT, but then turn around and get the VAT returned to them based on a credit of their tax bill or based on payment from the government. But that means everybody in that supply chain from a transfer of ownership has to have a VAT registration number in that country or it all falls apart. And it's big money. So you need to make sure everybody in the supply chain that's either buying and selling that equipment is VAT registered as it gets into the country such that your owner, your client, has the ability to earn that tax credit.
That's a really important point. Thanks
Now,
for.
if you look to buy in country, the same thing applies. Generally, if you manufacture in country and export, VAT does not apply. But if we as a U.S. company decide to buy local in South America to deliver straight to the job site, that local manufacturer has to charge us VAT. Right. Now, some countries, and I don't know in South America which ones might allow this, but some countries do allow to have a drop shipment certificate program where the seller can eliminate the VAT, not charge it, but somebody's going to sign a certificate in country basically identifying they're responsible for that VAT and it is going to get paid. And that takes the seller off the hook.
Great information. Appreciate that, guys. Taking questions from the audience. Dax.
sales tax involved in that transaction?
There is a VAT tax in the destination country, yes.
No, inside the U.S.
No.
No, inside the U.S. As a manufacturer to the reseller, and then the reseller to the final customer, there is a VAT, just in the last transaction,
Where's the reseller located?
inside the U.S. All in the U.S. All in the U.S. Because for me, the U.S. is international, right? For you, it's local. So that's what I'm asking.
Well, when you say, who did you purchase it from? Did you purchase it from the
Emerson Network Power in Ohio
Okay.
is selling the equipment to Lieber Tampa, for example.
Yeah.
And then Lieber Tampa is selling that to the final customer. Where is the tax involved in that transaction?
On the import side in the destination country, there will be a prepayment, there will be a payment of VAT at that particular time. And then,
But the final customer is in Tampa. It's not an import thing, it's just local.
oh, just as a local, well, there is no VAT in the United States.
There's sales tax.
So this kind of equipment is exempt of paying the tax?
Of a VAT, no, there may be subject to a state tax. And as a seller, if you get a tax exemption certificate, then you don't
But
charge.
it's basically the last transaction. The wholesaler doesn't pay, the reseller doesn't pay a tax. Only that last retail transaction gets taxed. Sales tax, not a VAT. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, so in the U.S., it's a sales tax, which is charged based on the state and the municipality where that might be going. But
Because in Mexico, it's all a chain. It's a chain. If it is broken, everything falls apart. That's why we don't understand why we don't have a chain here.
yeah.
Who pays the customer, right? The sales tax. Because in Mexico, you defer the payment to the next in the chain.
Next.
Exactly.
And you can do this in the U.S., the same thing happens if you provide a reseller certificate that you're going to resell it, you pass then the responsibility for the tax to whoever's buying it. So if I'm buying it in the U.S. and I'm planning to pay the tax, I provide a resale certificate to the manufacturer. That resale certificate says I own the tax liability now in the United States and will pay the tax. If I don't provide a resale certificate, they're going to charge me the tax.
Right.
Go ahead.
Question for the OEMs, speaking of Brazil and some of the tough import duties that they require for equipment coming into country, with upcoming major world global events, the Olympics, things of that nature, World Cup, do you guys see or forecast that they're going to be relaxing those to make it a little bit more pro-business, or do you feel like in the next 3 to 5 years it's going to be difficult to import your equipment into the country?
Well, Latin America, the only thing I've learned over the years is there really is no change. Things may sort of come and go, but the long-term trend is it's difficult doing business in Latin America. So if there's a short-term trend that maybe things are relaxed for a short period of time, chances are something's going to happen later on that will reverse that.
You guys touched on transportation just a little bit. What about when you're coming, say, across the border into Mexico, and customs wants to take the equipment apart? What have you had to address as far as packaging and leaving the facility in the U.S. and being able to repackage it after they take it apart crossing the border?
Make it easy to take the packaging off and put it back on. I mean, because they are going to, and you need to have your representation, your freight forwarder or your broker there to assist, right? Because you need to make sure it gets packaged back up correctly to transport into Mexico, because the roads in Mexico are not the roads in the United States, and a lot of things can happen between Laredo and the project site.
Have you found that the repackaging is available to do that right there near customs, or do you have to drive a certain distance inland before you can really kind of stop on the side of the road and get it packaged up?
Our broker's been doing it there, so at the border.
I'm not aware of too many instances where they've actually gone to that level to tear apart the packaging. And we do quite a bit of exporting into Mexico. We have manufacturing facilities that we export to as well as selling to our customers. And generally speaking, when we sell it to the customers, we're making a delivery, to Laredo's, the general location. They take the delivery there at a warehouse, and then they arrange their own customs clearance to get it across the border. And I've not heard of any horror stories coming back saying that because of the packaging, that, you know, how do we repackage this?
Well, one of these examples may have to do with skid-type equipment, where you have several pieces of components and all that paperwork that's important to be lined up with all those different components. They may want to dive into each one of those.
Yeah, because you're ending up with, you know, 4 or 5 components there, and looking at whether you're importing it as an assembly or importing it as individual components. You're absolutely right.
I think it's fair to say that you've got to allocate that in your schedule when it comes to lead time, and including delivery, right?
And in your cost.
Agreed. Yeah.
So, I mean, you touched on NAFTA. So what is the advantage and what's the disadvantage?
Well, getting lower duty rates for the customer, and basically lowering the overall cost for the customer by taking advantage of NAFTA and getting the duty exemption. In addition to a duty exemption, within, say, Mexico, they have a merchandise processing fee, and I forget what the acronym is. In the United States, we call it merchandise processing fee, and that's also exempt. So you really lower your cost of doing business. And Mexico has been lowering their duty rates, but some of the duty rates can still be fairly substantial.
But it's dependent on on the product actually being certified.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Right.
And is that a difficult process?
Yes.
To do as a manufacturer to get it certified?
It can be. I mean, you need to understand the rules. So, I mean, you have to issue a certificate of origin to the importer. The importer cannot claim NAFTA unless he has a completed, signed, valid certificate of origin. In order to do that, you have to have internal processes established that allows you to qualify that. And we talked about customs tariff classifications. That's where the rules start at. So each classification has its own rules. So you have to say, well, this is the classification of the product. I go to the rules, and they have what's called tariff shift rules and regional value rules. So you have to say, you know, what's my tariff shift, if I have it? What's the regional value content? Do I have it? And then you have to have the documentation to support that. And I think it's important to have the documentation, have the backup, have the record retention, because you are going to be subject to audit from time to time. And we've gone through a couple of audits on the U.S. side for products that we've imported from Mexico. We went through a fairly substantial Mexican audit about 10 years ago for some of the cooling equipment that we've shipped. Again, we had to go in and show our documentation, our proof to substantiate how we gave a NAFTA certificate for this product.
But I was just going to add to that, there's different percent of value from, to qualify for NAFTA that has to come from, if we're building it in the U.S. It's just because it's assembled and final assembled in the U.S. does not necessarily mean that it's NAFTA qualified. And it's up to the manufacturer to understand what those requirements are, and that we do comply or don't comply, and then can provide that certificate. So it's very, very important that everyone understands, again, up front what those requirements are going to be, so that we can say, yes, we are compliant, or no, we're not, so that the cost can be accounted for. And it can become, critical as to, who gets the order. If one manufacturer does comply and another one doesn't, there's real cost involved, and that have to be weighed out between the prices.
And there are costs and there are risks, and there are companies that I know of that refuse to issue NAFTA certificates because they don't want the risk.
Right.
It's always a benefit from a cost perspective. I would say, even with all the things you need to do to get across the border and deal with making sure it's certified, it's still a net benefit to the clients and to the owners to buy NAFTA-based equipment. Having said that, you need to verify from a purchasing perspective that the NAFTA certificate exists, because the assembly issue, most equipment that's assembled here in the U.S., you take your switchgear for instance, many of the breakers are not made in the U.S., and you look at the component cost of the breakers versus the sheet metal on the bus, it won't qualify for NAFTA. So don't make the assumption, get the certificate, and if they can't provide a certificate, then assume you're going to pay the duty. And that's the only way to truly levelize proposals from multiple manufacturers, is either they provide the certificate and take the risk that they can provide it duty-free, or you assume you're going to pay the duty.
That was great information, guys. Really appreciate your time. Take my mess.
Thank you, Jack and Company. Just to add to part of the risk conversation that they were talking about with credit risk, I worked on a project dealing with West Africa, the Ivory Coast, and we got about halfway through the project, and due to their government politics, it was a government-funded project. They had gone through a new election. A new official was elected. The president of the country didn't want to leave based on not being elected president anymore. So there was now a coup, and there were months of going back and forth till they could run that president out of the country. In the meantime, the World Bank froze their funds, and the project was on hold for a good year. So just the added risk of working outside the country and the difference in the political regimes.